Here we go. Week 17, for a lot of you, that's your fantasy championship. Whatever you're playing for, let's keep doing what we've been doing that got us this far. It's being active on the waiver wire, making smart moves that'll get you the best team for this week. Week 16 was a wild one. Thankfully, it didn't include too many injuries, but there were a couple of major ones, so let's get those out of the way with before I tell you who to pick up on waivers. Of course, the big one, kind of a scary injury you saw on Saturday, was Tank Dell. The official word is a dislocated kneecap, which is probably just as painful as it sounds. We know he is done for this year and likely a good chunk, if not all of next year. So he's going to leave a big hole in that Texans receiving game, which is already without Stephon Diggs for most of this year. We'll see if there's any good solutions available on the wire. And in that same game, Xavier Worthy stepped up for the Chiefs, but then stepped out with an ankle injury. Haven't heard any updates as of yet, but this is definitely something to keep an eye on. On Sunday, a couple of very impactful ones, and of course, Jalen Hurts going out early in that game with a concussion. It didn't seem major at first, but he never came back, and that left Kenny Pickett to pick up the slack. And look, it wasn't his fault they lost, but I'll tell you what, you can't feel great about that offense with him instead of Jalen Hurts next week if that's the case. So we'll definitely want to monitor his status going forward. And James Conner, after going for a huge game as expected against the Panthers, late in that game, he left with an apparent knee injury. So definitely something to keep an eye on because he's been so good lately, and he's somebody you really hope you can just plug in your lineup for the championship. But this is a guy who has avoided injury all year. Hopefully this isn't the time where he finally misses a game. And finally, the guy we got more questions than anyone about this weekend, it was Kenneth Walker. He came back and then he left again with an ankle injury, same injury as before. It sounds like it might be, although right now it's a little too early for me to say that for sure, but man, we know we've seen this before with Walker's out again. That's going to lead us to a very obvious pickup if he's somehow still available. Before I get into that, let me also remind you that you should be making your picks right now for Underdog because there are some games on Wednesday, some Saturday games, a Thursday game still. It's going to be an early week for the NFL, so get your picks in. And if you still haven't signed up for Underdog, why don't you take this free pick? It's Pat Mahomes getting 1 yard. So yeah, whether you're a fan or not, it doesn't matter. It's a free pick. He gets a yard, you win. You combine that with any other pick you like. You get that freebie if you're signing up for the first time as a new customer and you use code ENDGAME when you check out. Also, you can still get up to $1,000 of bonus cash on your initial deposit. Again, use code ENDGAME and try Underdog now. The obvious top target, if he's still on waivers, is going to be Zach Charbonnet. Now, I know a lot of people had already scooped up Zach Charbonnet because Kenneth Walker had missed a couple games. We weren't even sure about his status until midweek, but then just as he comes back, he's gone again. I bet you there are some people who had to cut Charbonnet because they had to make that tough roster decision, didn't think you might need him. And look, there are some leagues that he just wasn't picked up because they are on the shallow side. So I don't expect that he's available in a lot of competitive leagues, but I have to say, if Walker's out, look, as bad as Charbonnet looked this week, because he did nothing, and I literally mean he did nothing. He actually had negative 1 yard rushing and just a little bit of receiving work. That's because Walker was there. It was a tough game. Walker's still the starter whenever he's playing. Minnesota's run defense is good, so I'm not going to worry about that. Just remember 2 weeks ago, Zach Charbonnet dropped a 40-point PPR game. That's right. He literally won weeks single-handedly. He has that kind of upside, and it's a great matchup against the Bears. This Bears run defense is 4th worst in terms of giving up fantasy points per game to running backs, giving up 4.8 yards per carry to running backs. This is a great matchup. If Walker's out, I think you have to pick up Sharp if he's out there, and you have to almost play him unless you are stacked at running back. Now, here's a familiar name, Tyjae Spears. Yeah, I know that a lot of what we talked about last week with Spears being a great ad was not just because he had a good game last week. A lot of that was on the receiving end. It was in the second half. It was, come from behind mode, not so much just garbage time. I guess you can call it garbage time. But then Tony Pollard was the big one. You wondered if he was going to play because he's been injured, listed on the injury report for the past couple of weeks, almost every day. He was also a game time decision and wound up playing, but it was still Spears who wound up being the fantasy stud. And believe it or not, for the second week in a row, 2 touchdowns. So this is interesting because Pollard did play. He didn't leave this game because of injury, but he's clearly not right because all of a sudden Spears and Pollard are not only splitting touches, but Spears is the goal line back. Spears had more carries than Pollard in this game, and he had more receptions. Now, all told, without the touchdowns, it wouldn't have been too impressive. But again, this is the Titans. Nothing's really too impressive about them. The good thing is, number one, it's Mason Rudolph instead of Will Levis, so they have a chance to actually move the ball and not just turn it over, although I can't really say that because Mason Rudolph had 3 interceptions. But somehow Mason Rudolph leads them to score when he's not throwing interceptions, unlike Levis. And on the other hand, look, the Titans are going to have to try to move the ball a lot because they're going to get scored on a lot. And so in this week's matchup, again, Tyjae Spears is going to be risky, but they are playing the Jaguars. Yeah, playing the Jaguars is always good for an offense. The Jaguars right now allowed most fantasy points to running backs than any defense other than Carolina, which is still clearly the worst. And only Carolina and Chicago have allowed more touchdowns to running backs. So we have to acknowledge that even if Pollard plays, Spears has fantasy value, just like last week. And even if Spears doesn't get a ton of touches or even get a ton of yards, he has tremendous touchdown upside. 4 touchdowns in 2 weeks. Now he faces the defense that gives up almost the most touchdowns to running backs. So yeah, Pollard is probably going to be on the injury report again this week. He's probably going to give it a go again this week. A lot of people speculating he just wants to get out there and try to get his incentives for the season, hit those yardage and touchdown markers. I mean, whatever, that's fine. But Spears definitely has value as part of a 50-50 backfield now. And one more running back that almost pains me to mention here because I really don't want to be in on Gus Edwards, but if you're still looking for a running back at this point, you need help. I mean, Gus Edwards does have touchdown upside. We knew this all along. He just hadn't been showing it because he had looked really bad. But hey, all of a sudden, week 16, here we go. Not only did he score 2 touchdowns, which will happen from time to time, but he had the most carries since week 2. 14 carries in the backfield. Kamani Vidal is just a non-factor now. And not only that, but this was his first time breaking 50 yards rushing since week 10. Now those numbers, 14 carries, 68 yards, not super impressive for fantasy, but the touchdown upside remains. And this Chargers offense is going to have to try to continue to establish the run. But I also wouldn't be mentioning Gus if it wasn't a great matchup for him. It's the Patriots. You know it's not a great defense. Bottom 10 against the run. They've given up a lot of 100-yard games to running backs recently. And so Gus Edwards could continue to get fed. I'm not going to say he has the highest ceiling, especially in a PPR league. He at least has the potential to get you double digits and maybe more. Another player I talked about last week as a possible add was Hollywood Brown. I was thinking more next week, but hey, why not go ahead and do something in your very first game as a Chief? Now, overall, it wasn't super impressive, 5 catches for 45 yards, but it's actually remarkable that he was second on the team in both targets and catches. He was targeted 8 times, so he already is doing better than DeAndre Hopkins. But this becomes more significant because, as I mentioned, Xavier Worthy was leading receiver for this team and leading target getter. And if that ankle bothers him, if he's not able to give it a go, remember the Chiefs play on Wednesday. This is a short turnaround. So all of a sudden, it could be Hollywood Brown, number 1 receiver for Pat Mahomes and the Chiefs. Although they face a tough Steelers defense on the road, you know that their top corner, Joey Porter Jr., left last week with an injury, also a short turnaround for him. If he's not able to give it a go, feeling a lot better about Hollywood's chances. And now we finally have a brand new name, a guy I'm pretty sure I've not talked about all season long. Do we have a new number 1 receiver for New England? It looks like we may be looking at Kayshon Boutte as the top target here. Now, technically, the tight end Hunter Henry was the top target in Week 16, but as far as receivers go, Boutte has stepped up. Look, Javon Baker is hurt. He's probably not coming back this season. Jalen Polk has just been a non-factor. He barely even sees the field and definitely doesn't get targets. Demario Douglas is what he is. He's fine. He's there. He makes his presence felt once in a while. But Kayshon Boutte has been their big play guy. And look, this week, he scored a touchdown. He almost had another one. He drew a DPI in the end zone. And he's out there for the most snaps out of any receiver. And that's something that's been recurring. He came away with a team best 95 yards on 5 catches this week. And this was against a very tough Bills pass defense. And so Drake May kind of showed something. Of course, they weren't able to get the win, but still a pretty good performance for him. A pretty good showing for Boutte. He's going to get the Chargers next week. This is a team that's not as tough in terms of pass defense as the Bills. So look, looking for upside at this point, pure upside, even though Demario Douglas is the guy we kind of go to and figure, well, we know he'll get targets. At least Boutte could do something significant. It's time to talk quarterback, and if you're looking for somebody in a league where you stream, I think it's got to be Bo Nix. Took a chance on Bonix a couple of weeks ago in a pretty nice matchup. It didn't pay off. He looked rough right before and after the bye, just turning it over left and right. I'm not sure why, but he corrected that mistake this past week against a pretty good Chargers defense. Look, the numbers were okay: 263 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions though, and that's the key. The ball control is there. He had a nice game, good showing. And then here we go with the best matchup possible. And I know what you're going to say, so let me just get ahead of it here. Knicks and the Broncos are going to face the Bengals this week. And you know, when I think Bengals, I think shootout, because that offense is just completely on fire and their defense has been getting torched until the last 2 weeks. The Bengals have suddenly become one of the best streaming defenses for fantasy, but let me just make sure that you understand why. This defense didn't overnight all of a sudden learn to tackle better, get better. This is the fact that they have played in the last 2 weeks Will Levis and Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I'm pretty sure any defense can look great against those guys. Cincinnati will force Denver to have to throw to keep up with them. It's going to be probably a high-scoring game here. This is just how Bengals games had been going until they faced two of the worst teams in the league in Cleveland and Tennessee. So you want some upside? I think it's got to be Knicks, and he's still available in at least 1/3 of all fantasy leagues. Hopefully, if you've been playing the streaming game all season, he's out there for you. And at tight end, I'll give you two options actually. And number one, it's going to be a guy that really was an afterthought all season long, but now we have to pay attention again to Dalton Schultz. Dalton Schultz basically has been one of the biggest busts at tight end because he hasn't been hurt all year. He just has done nothing. Somehow, he has now caught a touchdown after scoring this past week against KC. In 2 of the last 3 games, he has scored, which is amazing considering the fact he didn't score a single touchdown in the months of September, October, and November combined. That's right, he went from 0 touchdowns the first 12 weeks of the season to all of a sudden scoring in 2 of the last 3. Don't like to chase touchdowns, but here's what I'll chase. Target share, it's increased, and you know it's got to increase again because Tank Dell is gone. And let's face it, there just aren't any other great options at wide receiver. I might be tempted to look at a guy like John Mechie. He didn't even play last week. He wasn't active because of a shoulder injury. I don't even know if he's going to be active for this week, but still, I think CJ Stroud's going to look more towards a guy like Schultz that he's had that connection with than any other receiver not named Nico Collins. So if you need a tight end and Schultz is available, which he still is in about half of fantasy leagues, he should be your top target. And if Schultz isn't out there, or you just want to go for, I guess we could say, a ceiling here, believe it or not, I'm going with another Titan this week. This could be your random late season, I guess, league winner. No, that seems a little bit too strong. League winning helper. It's Chig Okonkwo. And this really is as random as an outburst as you could imagine. He'd gone all season long, not catching more than 4 passes in a game. And then all of a sudden, the last 2 weeks, 8 catches last week, 9 catches this week. And that's come on the strength of 21 combined targets just in the last 2 games. The fact that Mason Rudolph suddenly came back in as a starting quarterback can't be a coincidence. But look, whatever the reason is, it doesn't matter. All of a sudden, Okonkwo is just getting fed. And so it was Nick Westbrook-Ikhine in the middle of the season that become a, out of nowhere guy for Tennessee that was fantasy relevant. And now it's Okonkwo. When a guy manages to score 17 PPR points without even getting in the end zone, you have to take notice. And of course, it doesn't hurt the fact that the matchup for Titans, as I mentioned before, it's the Jacksonville Jaguars. And if you're in your championship game this weekend, look, your bench is really not going to matter too much. You need to make room for some upside for a streamer or whatever. Let's get rid of some of those veterans that you're not going to start. Stink Cobra Kai. No mercy. Let's begin with the Chiefs. And, somehow Isaiah Pacheco coming back has not helped a single person. Pacheco just does not look right ever since he came back from the IR. In fact, some of last week, he actually had fewer carries than Kareem Hunt and looked less efficient. Hunt, the one who got the touchdown, he's getting the goal line carries. Pacheco's barely even able to manage 3 yards a carry since he's returned. Clearly not the same guy. You're not going to start him. You can't risk it. So there's no need to roster him anymore. And while I know we want players on good offenses, I think it's about time we just said enough with the Bills receivers, other than Khalil Shakir, who's clearly the number 1 target there. There are way too many Amari Cooper and Keon Coleman questions still going on, guys. Why do you still want to start them? I know Josh Allen is great, maybe the MVP, best fantasy quarterback, fine. That doesn't mean all of his receivers are going to be fantasy relevant. So just to drive that point home, again, this last week, week 16, Amari Cooper, Keon Coleman, each exactly 2 targets and 1 catch. If you haven't taken a look at the stat line for each player recently, I suggest you do that and then drop them. And then finally, I'll just start with the logical approach here. Statistically speaking, Travis Etienne has been very inefficient. 8 carries, 26 yards against the Raiders. Tank Bigsby still not only out-carrying him, outperforming him. I mean, Travis Etienne just does not have enough upside to help your fantasy team win a championship. And then there's the fact that if you still have Travis Etienne on your roster, how are you in the finals, first of all? And second of all, why? Just why? Let's cleanse not only the roster, but cleanse your soul. Purge your roster of this albatross that has been dragging your team, or at least trying to drag it down. He is the biggest bust of the season. It's about time that you caught him if you didn't yet. If you've come this far, you want to make sure you do everything possible to take home the championship. That includes all our start sit advice and more. Everything you need to win is in this playlist.